name is Arthur Finch. I'm 67 years old now, but this happened a decade ago, back when I still thought I had the world figured out. For 35 years, I was a fish and game warden for the state of Michigan. I spent my life in the woods, tracking, observing, and managing the wild things that live there. I've seen mountain lions where they weren't supposed to be, dealt with problem bears, and tracked poachers through the worst blizzards the Upper Peninsula could throw at a man. I knew the sounds, the smells, the rhythms of the forest better than I knew the streets of my own town. I was comfortable there. I was competent. I thought I knew every secret the woods held. I was wrong. The trip was supposed to be a final send-off to the season. It was late October, the air sharp with the coming promise of winter, the tamaracks blazing a fiery gold against the deep greens of the pines. My friend, Jake Sterling, had a small cabin on a remote lake north of Ironwood.
It wasn't much, just a single room with a wood stove and a few bunks, but it was miles from any paved road, and the fishing was unparalleled. Jake was a retired carpenter, a man as solid and reliable as the oak trees he used to build with. He invited me and his nephew Brian up for a long weekend of pike fishing and whiskey drinking. Brian was in his late 20s, a city kid from Grand Rapids who worked in IT. He was a good kid, but the woods made him jumpy. Every snap of a twig was a bear, every hoot of an owl was something sinister. Jake and I usually got a good-natured laugh out of it. We'd been coming to this cabin for years, and the most dangerous thing we'd ever encountered was a territorial porcupine that tried to take up residence under the porch. This time, however, the usual light-hearted teasing had a different feel. It was as if the woods themselves were listening, and they didn't appreciate the intrusion. We arrived on a Thursday afternoon. The drive in was rough, the last 10 miles a barely there two-track that rattled the fillings in my teeth. The cabin stood in a small clearing about 50 yards from the lakeshore. The quiet was immediate and profound. It was a heavy silence, not the peaceful kind filled with the buzz of insects and the chatter of squirrels. The air was still, too still. I remember standing by the truck, just listening, and feeling a faint prickle on the back of my neck. I dismissed it as the chill in the air. Jake unlocked the heavy padlock on the door and we hauled our gear inside. The cabin smelled of cedar and cold ash. While Jake got the wood stove going, Brian started telling some ridiculous story he'd heard on a podcast about a Bigfoot sighting in Wisconsin. He was trying to get a rise out of us, his voice echoing a little too loudly in the small space. They said it through a log at their car, he said, his eyes wide with mock seriousness.
Jake just grunted and shoved another piece of birch into the stove. The only thing throwing logs out here is gravity, kid. Now make yourself useful and get some water from the lake. That first evening was normal enough. We fished from the small aluminum boat Jake kept chained to a tree, pulling in a few decent-sized pike. The sunset was spectacular, a bleeding smear of orange and purple across the water. As dusk settled, a thick fog rolled in off the lake, blanketing the clearing and muffling all sound. We sat on the porch, nursing glasses of bourbon, the only light coming from the warm glow of the cabin's windows. The familiar comfort of the place felt different, somehow thin and fragile against the pressing darkness and the fog. The first sign that something was wrong came later that night. We were all in our bunks, the fire in the stove banked down to a warm glow. I was drifting in that space between wakefulness and sleep when I heard it. It was a sound that didn't belong.
It wasn't an animal call, not a wolf or a coyote. It was a deep, rhythmic thump. It came from the woods, somewhere to the east of the cabin. It was slow, deliberate. Thump, thump, thump. It sounded heavy, like something massive was striking a tree with incredible force. I lay there, perfectly still, straining my ears. Jake was a notoriously light sleeper. I heard his bunk creak as he shifted. The thumping stopped as suddenly as it had begun, leaving a silence that felt deeper and more unnerving than before. I waited for what felt like an hour, but the sound didn't return. I tried to rationalize it. A dead tree finally giving way and falling, maybe? But the sound was too regular, too intentional. It wasn't the chaotic crash of a falling tree. It was a pattern. My warden training kicked in, cataloging possibilities. None of them fit. I told myself I was tired, my mind playing tricks on me in a strange place. I eventually fell into a restless sleep, the memory of that sound echoing in my dreams. The next morning, the fog had burned off, leaving a crisp, clear autumn day. Over coffee, I asked Jake if he'd heard anything strange during the night. He looked at me over the rim of his mug, his expression thoughtful. "Heard it," he said simply. "Sounded like someone chopping wood with a sledgehammer." Brian, who had apparently slept through the whole thing, just laughed. "Probably your Bigfoot, Brian," I said, trying to make a joke of it, but my own voice sounded hollow. The unease from the night before hadn't left me. It sat like a cold stone in my gut. We decided to take a walk around the lake, check some of the other coves for good fishing spots. The woods were beautiful, the fall colors at their peak, but the silence persisted. There were no birds singing, no squirrels chattering in the branches. It was as if the entire forest was holding its breath. As a warden, I knew what this kind of silence often meant. A large predator was in the area. The smaller animals knew to lay low. I scanned the ground for tracks, my eyes automatically searching for sign. I saw plenty of deer tracks, some old coyote scat, but nothing that would explain the dead quiet. My hand kept drifting to the handle of the .44 Magnum I always carried in a hip holster when I was in the deep woods. We were about a half-mile from the cabin when we found it. The smell hit us first. The coppery, metallic scent of fresh blood, thick in the cool air. We followed it to a small clearing just off the trail. In the center of the clearing lay the remains of a large white-tailed doe. But it wasn't a predator kill. I've seen hundreds of kills in my career. Wolf, bear, coyote, cougar. They are messy, violent affairs, with entrails pulled out, flesh torn away in ragged chunks. This was different. The doe was lying in two pieces. It hadn't been ripped apart. It had been broken. The spine was snapped cleanly, as if a giant had taken the animal in two hands and bent it backward until it broke. The two halves lay about 10 feet apart. There were no bite marks on the torso, no signs of feeding, just this incredible, brutal display of force. The ground around the carcass was churned up, but the leaf litter was too thick to hold a clear print. I could make out a few large, indistinct impressions, but nothing I could identify. Brian turned pale and started to gag. Jake just stood there, his face grim, shaking his head slowly. "No bear did that," he muttered, his voice low. "A bear would have fed. It would have dragged the carcass off to a cache." I had to agree. The sheer physical power required to do that to a full-grown deer was staggering. It was beyond any animal I knew of. We stood there in silence for a long time, the wrongness of the scene washing over us. The woods no longer felt peaceful. They felt menacing. The feeling of being watched was so intense it was almost a physical pressure against my skin. "We should go back to the cabin," I said, my voice tight. We didn't talk on the walk back. The easy camaraderie of the trip was gone, replaced by a shared, unspoken fear. When we got back to the clearing, the cabin didn't look like a refuge anymore. It looked small and vulnerable, a tiny wooden box in an ocean of wilderness that suddenly felt alien and hostile. We locked the door behind us, the heavy bolt sliding home with a sound that was less reassuring than final. That afternoon, nobody suggested fishing. We stayed inside, cleaning our gear, stoking the fire,
doing anything to keep our hands and minds busy. I took out my rifle, a Winchester Model 70 and .30-06, and meticulously cleaned and oiled it, checking the action over and over. Jake did the same with his 12-gauge pump-action shotgun. Brian just sat on his bunk, quiet for once, staring out the window at the darkening trees.
The sun began to set, and the shadows grew long, creeping across the clearing like grasping fingers. As darkness fell, the temperature dropped. A cold wind began to blow, rattling the window panes and moaning in the eaves of the cabin. The woods outside were a wall of black. We lit the kerosene lamps, their warm light pushing back the gloom, but also making the darkness outside the windows seem even deeper and more absolute. We ate our dinner in near silence. The casual jokes and stories of the previous night were a distant memory. Every gust of wind, every creak of the cabin's logs made us jump. The sound started around 9 o'clock. It began with a faint scratching noise coming from the back wall of the cabin, the one that faced the thickest part of the forest. It sounded like claws, or maybe a heavy branch scraping against the logs in the wind. But the sound was too rhythmic, too deliberate. Scrape, pause, scrape, pause. Jake and I exchanged a look. He picked up his shotgun and stood by the door. I grabbed my rifle. Then came a different sound, a low, wet, sniffing noise right at the base of the door. It was loud, as if the nose of some massive animal was pressed right against the wood, inhaling our scent. We could hear the deep, guttural breaths. Brian, who was sitting closest to the door, scrambled backward off his bunk, his face a mask of terror. The sniffing went on for a minute, then stopped. The silence that followed was worse than the sound itself. We were all frozen, listening, our own breathing sounding deafeningly loud in the small room. Suddenly a voice cut through the night. It was a woman's voice, crying for help. "Please, help me. I'm lost." It came from the direction of the lake. The voice was filled with panic and pain. It sounded utterly convincing. Brian started to get up. "We have to help her," he whispered, his eyes wide. Jake grabbed his arm, hard. "Stay put," he hissed. I moved to the front window, peering cautiously through a gap in the curtains. The night was pitch black. I couldn't see a thing. "It's a trick," I said, my voice barely a whisper. "No woman would be out here, this far from any road, at this time of night. It's not real." My training had taught me about vocal mimicry in animals. Some birds could do it, but this was something else entirely. The cry came again, closer this time, more desperate. "Help! He's got me! Please!" It was a perfect imitation of human terror and desperation. A cold dread seeped into my bones. What kind of animal could mimic a human voice with such precision? And for what purpose? The answer was chillingly obvious: to lure prey out into the open. We stayed by the windows for what felt like hours, listening to the phantom cries. They moved around the cabin, sometimes seeming to come from the woods, sometimes from the lakeshore. It was a calculated, intelligent tactic designed to unnerve us, to make us doubt our own senses. Eventually the cries faded away, replaced once again by the sound of the wind. But we knew it wasn't over. We knew the thing was still out there, watching us, waiting. It was close to midnight when I saw it. I had been staring out the side window for so long that my eyes were burning. The moon had risen, and though it was mostly obscured by clouds, it cast a faint, silvery light on the clearing. For a split second the clouds parted, and the clearing was bathed in moonlight. And that's when I saw it. It was standing at the edge of the tree line, partially hidden by the shadow of a large pine. It was just a silhouette, but it was enough. It was huge, taller than any man, broader than any bear. It was standing on two legs, but they weren't human legs. They were bent backward, like a dog's. Its shoulders were massive and its arms were long, hanging down almost to its knees. But the head was the worst part. Even in silhouette, I could see the distinct shape of a long, canine snout with pointed ears silhouetted against the moon. It stood perfectly still for a moment, its head tilted as if it were listening. Then, as quickly as the moonlight had appeared, the clouds covered it again, and the shape was gone, swallowed by the darkness. I stumbled back from the window, my heart hammering against my ribs. I couldn't breathe. I tried to speak, to tell Jake what I'd seen, but only a choked gasp came out. Jake saw the look on my face. "What is it, Art? What did you see?" I finally managed to get the words out, my voice trembling. "It's out there, by the trees. It's not a bear." I didn't know how to describe what I had seen. It was something from a nightmare, a creature that defied every law of nature I had spent my life studying. We didn't sleep that night. We sat with our backs to the wood stove, our weapons across our laps, watching the windows and the door. Every creak of the cabin, every rustle of leaves outside sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. The night stretched on, an eternity of tense silence and suffocating fear. We knew we were being hunted. The thing outside wasn't just a curious animal. It was intelligent, and it was malevolent. It was playing with us, testing our defenses, enjoying our fear. Dawn seemed like a distant, impossible dream. The third day dawned gray and oppressive. A cold, steady rain began to fall, turning the clearing into a muddy mess. The thought of spending another night in that cabin was unbearable. We had to leave. We made a plan: pack only the essentials, get to my truck, and drive out of there as fast as we could. We wouldn't even stop to lock up the cabin. We just had to get away. We worked quickly and quietly, stuffing our gear into our packs. The atmosphere was thick with dread. We were moving like soldiers behind enemy lines, every sound making us flinch. When we were ready, we gathered at the door. I held my rifle, Jake his shotgun. Brian had a small .38 revolver that looked like a toy in his shaking hands. "On three," I said, my voice low. "We move fast, straight to the truck. Don't stop for anything. 1, 2, 3. Jake threw the bolt and yanked the door open. We burst out into the rain, our boots sinking into the mud. The truck was only 30 yards away, but it felt like miles. We ran, slipping and sliding in the muck, our eyes scanning the tree line. The woods were silent, watchful. We reached the truck, gasping for breath, our hearts pounding. I fumbled for my keys, my fingers clumsy with cold and fear. I jammed the key into the lock and threw the driver's side door open. "Get in," I yelled. Jake and Brian piled into the passenger side. I jumped into the driver's seat, slammed the door, and jammed the key into the ignition. The engine turned over, coughed, and died. I tried again. Nothing. Just a weak, grinding sound. "What's wrong?" Brian asked, his voice high with panic. I popped the hood and got out, my rifle in my hand. The rain was plastering my hair to my forehead. I lifted the hood, and my blood ran cold. The battery cables had been severed, not chewed through, but cut. The cuts were clean, precise, and there, on the engine block, was a single, long, muddy handprint. It was shaped like a human hand, but it was massive, with long, slender fingers tipped with what looked like claw marks. It had been here. While we were huddled in the cabin, it had come right up to the truck and disabled it. It had been one step ahead of us the whole time. It knew we would try to escape. A wave of despair washed over me. We were trapped. 10 miles of logging road between us and civilization, with a storm rolling in and a monster in the woods. "It cut the cables," I said, my voice flat.
The reality of our situation settled over us like a shroud. We were cut off, isolated, and being hunted by something we couldn't possibly understand. We retreated back to the cabin, the short-lived hope of escape extinguished. The small wooden building now felt less like a shelter and more like a tomb. We barricaded the door with the heavy wooden table and piled our spare gear against it. We checked the windows, making sure the shutters were latched tight. There was nothing to do but wait for nightfall, and for the thing that hunted us to return. The afternoon dragged on. The rain intensified, drumming a relentless tattoo on the metal roof. We conserved our flashlight batteries, sitting in the dim gray light that filtered through the cracks in the shutters. No one spoke. The fear was a living thing in the room with us, a cold, heavy presence that squeezed the air from our lungs. I thought about my life, my family.
I had faced down armed poachers and cornered bears, but I had never felt fear like this. This was a primal, helpless terror, the fear of a prey animal that knows the predator is closing in. As dusk fell, the rain finally stopped. The woods outside grew quiet again, but it was the same predatory silence from the day before. We knew it was out there. We could feel it. The attack began without warning. There was a tremendous crash against the side of the cabin, a sound like a car wreck. The entire structure shuddered, and a jar of coffee grounds fell from a shelf and shattered on the floor. I rushed to one of the peepholes we had made in the shutters. It was standing in the middle of the clearing, no longer hiding in the shadows. The fading light revealed it in all its horrific detail. It was at least 8 feet tall, with a powerful, muscular build. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur, matted with mud and rain.
Its legs were digitigrade, bending backward like a wolf's, and its long, powerful arms ended in those huge 5-fingered hands with dirty, yellowed claws. But the head was the stuff of pure nightmare. It was the head of a monstrous wolf or a German shepherd, with a long snout, powerful jaws, and pointed ears. And in that canine face were 2 eyes that burned with a malevolent, terrifying intelligence. They glowed with a faint yellow light in the dusk. It was looking right at the cabin. It knew we were watching. It let out a sound that was half roar, half howl, a deafening blast of fury that vibrated through the logs of the cabin and into my bones. Then it charged. It didn't run like an animal. It moved with a terrifying, loping bipedal gait, covering the ground with incredible speed. It slammed into the cabin wall again, and the wood groaned in protest. We could hear its claws scrabbling for purchase on the logs, trying to tear its way in.
"Shoot it!" Brian screamed, his voice cracking with hysteria. "For God's sake, shoot it!" Jake and I moved to the windows on opposite sides of the cabin. "Aim for the chest, the head," I yelled, my voice strained. "Don't just spray and pray." I braced my rifle against the window frame, found the creature's massive torso in my sights, and squeezed the trigger. The .30-06 boomed in the confined space, the recoil slamming into my shoulder. I saw the bullet hit. A tuft of fur flew from its shoulder. The creature roared in pain and anger, but it didn't go down. It barely even staggered. It just seemed to get angrier. Jake fired his shotgun, the blast of buckshot tearing into the creature's leg. It howled again and spun around, its intelligent eyes locking onto Jake's window. It was incredibly fast. Before Jake could pump another round into the chamber, the creature was at his window. It smashed its massive fist through the wooden shutter, sending splinters flying into the room. A long, clawed arm reached inside, swiping blindly. Jake scrambled back, barely avoiding the claws that would have torn his face off. Brian lost it. He started firing his little revolver wildly through the broken shutter, the small pops of the gun sounding pathetic after the roar of the rifle and shotgun. The creature's arm retracted, and then we heard a sound of twisting metal. The arm reappeared, holding Brian's mangled revolver, which it had apparently snatched from his hand. It dropped the crushed piece of metal on the ground outside, and then its arm shot back in, this time finding its target. It grabbed Brian by the front of his jacket and lifted him off his feet, dragging him toward the shattered window. Brian screamed, a high, thin sound of pure terror. He was being pulled through the window frame, the wood splintering around him. Jake and I were frozen for a split second in disbelief. This thing was not just strong, it was smart.
It had disarmed one of us and was now using him as a shield.
I couldn't get a clear shot without hitting Brian. "Do something," Jake yelled, snapping me out of my shock. He rushed forward and began beating at the creature's arm with the butt of his shotgun. The creature ignored him. It continued to pull Brian through the window. I made a decision. It was a terrible risk, but it was the only one I had. I aimed for the creature's arm, the thick, muscular forearm that was holding Brian. I fired. The bullet struck home. The creature roared in agony, and for a second, its grip loosened. It was enough. Jake grabbed Brian and pulled him back into the cabin, the two of them collapsing in a heap on the floor. The creature's arm retracted, and we heard it back away from the cabin, howling in rage. Brian was a mess. His shoulder was dislocated, and he had deep gashes on his chest and arms from the window frame and the creature's claws. He was in shock, babbling incoherently.
Jake and I dragged him away from the window and did our best to patch him up, our hands shaking so badly we could barely tie the bandages. We knew the creature wasn't gone. We had heard it, and now it would be even more determined to get to us. The siege continued for hours. The creature circled the cabin, slamming into the walls, tearing at the roof with its claws. The sound of its rage was a constant, terrifying presence. It threw rocks against the walls, heavy stones that hit with the force of cannonballs. We huddled in the center of the room, away from the walls, listening to the destruction, feeling the impacts vibrate through the floorboards. We were running low on ammunition. I had maybe 10 rounds left for my rifle. Jake had a handful of shotgun shells. It wasn't enough. We weren't going to survive another night. Sometime after midnight, the sounds on the roof became more frantic. We could hear shingles being ripped away, and then the sound of wood splintering. It was tearing a hole in the roof. A wave of cold, damp air washed down into the cabin, carrying the scent of pine and wet fur. We looked up. In the faint light from the kerosene lamp, we could see a dark, ragged hole appearing in the ceiling. Claws appeared, tearing away more of the wood. This was it. It was coming in. A desperate, crazy idea formed in my mind. The kerosene lamp. It was our only source of light, but it was also a weapon. "Jake," I whispered, my throat dry. "Get ready to open the door. When I throw this, we run. We run for the lake. It's our only chance." He looked at me, his face pale and drawn, and nodded. There was no other choice. Staying here meant certain death. I grabbed the lamp. It was hot to the touch. The creature's head appeared in the hole in the roof, its glowing yellow eyes fixing on us, its snout wrinkled back in a terrifying snarl. It opened its mouth, and a low growl rumbled through the cabin. I didn't hesitate. I swung the lamp in a wide arc and threw it with all my might. It sailed through the air and shattered against the creature's head and chest. The effect was instantaneous. Kerosene splashed everywhere, and the creature was engulfed in flames. It let out a shriek that was unlike anything I have ever heard, a sound of pure, unadulterated agony and terror. It thrashed wildly, its burning form falling back through the hole in the roof. We heard a heavy thud as it hit the ground outside. "Now!" I screamed. Jake threw the table away from the door and yanked it open. We half carried, half dragged the injured Brian out into the night. The creature was writhing on the ground, a pillar of fire, its shrieks echoing through the forest. It was a horrific, apocalyptic sight. We didn't look back. We ran for the dark water of the lake, stumbling over roots and rocks, our lungs burning. We plunged into the icy water, the shock of the cold taking our breath away. We waded out until the water was up to our chests and crouched behind the hull of the overturned aluminum boat, using it for cover. From there, we watched. The creature, still burning, managed to get to its feet. It staggered around the clearing, a terrifying beacon of light in the darkness, before finally crashing into the tree line and disappearing from sight. The shrieking faded, replaced by the crackle of the flames, which had now spread to the side of the cabin. We watched as our only shelter began to burn, the fire casting a hellish orange glow over the entire scene. We stayed in that freezing water for the rest of the night, shivering uncontrollably, listening for any sound of the creature's return. But there was nothing. Only the sound of the burning cabin and the lapping of the water. As the first gray light of dawn began to creep into the sky, we finally felt it was safe to move. Exhausted, hypothermic, and in shock, we crawled out of the lake and began the long, agonizing walk out of the woods. It took us nearly 5 hours to walk the 10 miles to the main road. Brian was delirious with pain and fever. Jake and I were running on pure adrenaline and fear. Every shadow seemed to hold a threat. Every sound made us jump. When we finally stumbled out of the trees and onto the blessed gravel of the county road, I almost collapsed with relief. A logging truck found us a few minutes later. The driver's eyes went wide at the sight of us, soaking wet, covered in mud and blood, with Brian barely conscious between us. He didn't ask many questions. He just got us into his cab and drove us straight to the hospital in Ironwood. The authorities got involved, of course. A sheriff's deputy named Miller took my statement in the hospital waiting room while doctors worked on Brian. I told him everything, exactly as it had happened.
I described the sounds, the snapped deer, the tracks, the creature itself. I told him about the disabled truck and the siege on the cabin. I watched his face as I spoke. He started out with a look of professional concern, which slowly morphed into skepticism, and finally settled on a kind of weary pity.
When I was finished, he just sighed and clicked his pen. "Mr. Finch," he said, his voice patronizingly gentle, "you've all been through a major trauma. It's a bear. Had to be. We get a lot of problem black bears this time of year. Getting bold before hibernation. Probably got into your cabin looking for food. You spooked it, and it went on the defensive. They can be unpredictable. A bear didn't sever my battery cables with a clean cut," I said, my voice rising. "A bear didn't mimic a woman's voice. A bear doesn't stand 8 feet tall on 2 legs and have hands." Miller just shook his head. "Your friend is seriously injured. The cabin burned down. Your truck was vandalized. I'll file a report, but I'm telling you, what you saw was a bear, magnified by fear and exhaustion." He closed his notebook. The investigation was over before it had even begun. They officially ruled it a bear attack. The local paper ran a small article about 3 fishermen who had a harrowing encounter with an aggressive black bear, which resulted in the destruction of a cabin. My 35 years of experience, my reputation as a level-headed and observant warden, meant nothing. I was just another panicked city dweller who couldn't tell a bear from a shadow. They dismissed everything that didn't fit their neat, tidy explanation. Jake backed up my story, but he was just another traumatized victim in their eyes. Brian had no clear memory of the attack, just fragmented images of terror. We were alone with the truth. A week later,
A young state trooper called me. He said he was following up on the report. He asked me a few standard questions, and then his tone changed.
He lowered his voice. "Listen, Mr. Finch," he said. "I'm not supposed to say this, but your story, it's not the first of its kind we've had from that area. Over the years, we've had a half-dozen reports of similar things. Tall, hairy, aggressive, always dismissed as bears or hoaxes. People go missing out there sometimes, too. Hunters, hikers, they just vanish. My advice to you? Don't go back. There are some places man isn't meant to be, and that's one of them." He hung up before I could ask any more questions. It was the only validation I ever received. It's been 10 years. Brian recovered physically, mostly, but he's never been the same. The easygoing city kid is gone, replaced by a quiet, haunted man who can't stand to be in a room with the lights off. Jake passed away a few years ago from a heart attack. I think the memory of that night just wore him down. As for me, I live with it every day. I sold my house near the woods and moved into a small apartment in town. I haven't set foot in a forest since that day, and I never will again. The place that was once my sanctuary is now the source of my deepest fears. I don't sleep much. When I do, the nightmares come. I see those glowing yellow eyes in the dark. I hear that shriek of rage and pain. I feel the cabin shuddering around me. I wake up in a cold sweat, the smell of burnt fur and wet pine in my nostrils. I've lost the peace and confidence that defined my life. I've been forced to accept a terrible truth, that the world is not the orderly, understandable place I thought it was. There are things out there, in the deep, dark corners of the wilderness that are beyond our comprehension. Things that are ancient, intelligent, and predatory. I know that most people who hear this story will think I'm crazy or that I was mistaken, just like that deputy did. I can't blame them. I would have thought the same thing 10 years ago. But I was there. I saw it. And I am telling you now as a warning. Heed the silence in the woods. Pay attention to the signs that don't make sense. And if you ever feel that prickle on the back of your neck, that feeling of being watched by something unseen, don't dismiss it. Get out. Don't wait to find out what it is. Because some secrets are not meant to be discovered. Some doors are not meant to be opened. And some things, once seen, can never be unseen.